Hi, how you doing? In this episode, we will replace the charging port in an Asus Vivobook. This week, we got 3 Asus notebooks with the same issue. Also, we try to explain why we charge more for a charging port replacement in an Asus notebook than a Dell notebook. Once all the screws are removed, use the plastic prying tool to gently pry open the bottom panel. Begin at one corner and carefully work your way around the edges. Be patient and gentle to avoid damaging the plastic clips that hold the panel in place. Once the panel is loosened, lift it off to reveal the internal components of the laptop. Next, locate the battery and disconnect it. The battery connector is usually a small plug connected to the motherboard. Gently unplug it by pulling it straight out. After disconnecting the battery, proceed to remove the screws, securing the battery to the chassis. Carefully lift the battery out of its compartment and set it aside. With the battery removed, you can now access the main board. The main board is the large circuit board that houses the laptop's central processing unit, CPU, memory, and other essential components. Begin by identifying and unplugging all the ribbon cables and connectors attached to the main board. Ribbon cables are thin, flat cables that connect various components, such as the keyboard, touchpad, and display to the main board. Use tweezers to gently lift the plastic locking tabs on the connectors and carefully slide the cables out. One of the main reasons replacing the charging port in an Asus Vivobook is more difficult is due to the design and accessibility of the internal components. Asus Vivobook models often have a more compact and tightly integrated design. This can make it harder to access the charging port without disassembling multiple layers of components. On the other hand, Dell Latitude notebooks are typically designed with easier access to key components for maintenance and upgrades, making the process of replacing the charging port more straightforward. The internal layout of the Asus Vivobook can be more intricate, with various components densely packed together. This means that to reach the charging port, you may need to remove the battery, disconnect multiple ribbon cables, and possibly even remove the main board. In contrast, Dell Latitude notebooks usually have a more modular design, with components like the charging port being more accessible and not requiring extensive disassembly. In many Asus Vivobook models, the charging port is soldered directly onto the main board. This means that to replace the port, you need to have soldering skills and the right equipment to desolder the old port and solder a new one in place. This adds a level of difficulty and risk, especially if you're not experienced with soldering. On the other hand, Dell Latitude notebooks often use modular charging ports that can be easily replaced without soldering. The port is usually connected to the main board via a cable or connector, making the replacement process much simpler. Dell Latitude notebooks are known for their user-friendly design, with clear instructions and service manuals available for users and technicians. This makes it easier to find step-by-step guidance for replacing components like the charging port. Asus Vivobook models may not have as extensive documentation, and their design may not prioritize user-friendly repairs, making it harder for an average user to perform the replacement. Replacing the charging port in an Asus Vivobook often requires specialized tools and precision due to the compact and intricate design. Once all the cables are disconnected, it's time to remove the screws securing the mainboard to the chassis. Be thorough in your search for screws, as some may be hidden under stickers or labels. Take note of the different screw sizes and lengths to ensure proper reassembly later on. With all the screws removed, carefully lift the mainboard out of the chassis. Take your time and ensure no cables or connectors are still attached. If you encounter resistance, double-check for any remaining screws or hidden connections. Once the mainboard is free, place it on an anti-static mat or clean, non-conductive surface. Now, it's time to replace the charging port. The charging port is typically located near the edge of the main board. To remove the old port, you'll need to desolder it. Use a hot air station on to heat up around 380 to 450 Celsius. Gently lift the old port off the main board once the solder is melted, cleaning out the holes easier if you heat up with a solder iron from one side and use a desoldering gun from the other side at the same time. This will be an efficient and quick method as the ground plate is hard to heat up. Position the new charging port in place and ensure it aligns correctly with the solder pads on the main board. Use the soldering iron to carefully solder the new port into place. Apply just enough solder to secure the connections without creating solder bridges or shorts. Once the new port is securely soldered, allow the connections to cool. A little cleaning is nice, but not necessary. We replaced the old thermal compound to prevent cooling issues and keep the main board in working order for another few years. It's time to reassemble the laptop. Start by placing the main board back into the chassis, aligning it properly with the screw holes. Secure the main board with the screws you previously removed. Ensure that each screw is tightened snugly, but not overly tight to avoid damaging the main board or chassis. Next, reconnect all the ribbon cables and connectors to the main board. Gently slide each ribbon cable into its connector and press down on the locking tabs to secure them. Double check that each cable is properly seated and that there are no loose connections. Once all the cables are reconnected, reinstall the battery by positioning it back into its slot and securing it with the screws. Then, reconnect the battery connector to the main board. Take a moment to inspect all connections and ensure everything is securely in place. Now reattach the bottom panel of the laptop. Carefully align it with the edges of the chassis and press down until it clicks into place. Use the Phillips screwdriver to screw the bottom panel back on, ensuring all screws are tightened. Congratulations, you've successfully disassembled the Asus Vivobook, replaced the charging port, and reassembled it. Now, power on the laptop to check if the new charging port works. If everything is functioning correctly, you've completed the repair successfully. I hope now you understand why does it cost more to replace the charging port on an Asus Notebook. To remove the main board and all the components, removing the faulty charging port and soldering the new one is adding extra time what we have to bill to the customers. It is much simpler when you just detach a cable and replace with a new one. An average charging port is for Dell or HP is cost around £9 and the labor is around 15 to 20 minutes. If you enjoyed our video, please like and subscribe. If you don't, please leave a comment and tell us what you didn't like so we can improve. See you next time.
Thank you for watching us. See you next time.